The newest 4-star Gaming can actually be a strong damage dealer, but there's a couple of things that need to be understood about him. So in this video, I will showcase to you his C0 potential and which teams and weapons as well as artifacts are best for him. Most importantly, I'll also explain to you the difference between C0 and C6 Gaming and reveal some unique details about him. So let's first take a quick look at Gaming's damage potential. I've equipped him with mailed Pyro Claymore, although there are other decent free-to-play options, while his artifact set is Hunters with attack, pyro damage, as well as crit rate circlet main stats. And as for his talents, they are all level 9, and for this part of the video, he is Constellation 0. Now, starting with his skill, by tapping it, he leaps into the air, and then you can do a special plunge attack, which deals 16,663 damage in a small AoE, and generates 2 particles for him. He also consumes 15% of his HP, but then his first passive restores him small amount of HP up to 4 times, and that's more than enough to fully max out the Hunter's 4-set passive, which is nice. Now, basically, if you want to spam the skill, you have to activate his burst, which will initially deal 23,530 damage, restore 30% HP to him, and then this cute Swanee companion will appear. And if you run into him, the skill's cooldown is reset, which means you can do the skill again and then meet back with Swanee once more. And so, at least personally, I was able to do 6 skill plunges over the 12-second period while this burst lasts. So in a nutshell, this turns him into a 4-star Pyro Xiao, where you can just spam his skill, and just like Xiao, he gains a cool new look, which to me kinda reminds me of those Tron movies. Also, important thing to note, if after completing the skill plunge, Gaming doesn't have more than 50% HP, he will not resummon Swanee. And as you can see, my plunging streak had ended quite early here. Anyway, since you can spam the skill, you can generate more particles, but sadly, it only happens every other skill, so in total, I usually end up collecting 6 particles, which is not a lot if I'm being honest, especially since the burst costs 60. But enough with looking at those sad damage numbers. Gaming excels best when you melt or vape his damage with buffs. And with this melt setup, he actually starts hitting pretty hard. 175k crit from the burst, a couple of skilled plunges doing almost 150k damage, and once buffs start to wear off, he can still deliver a couple of strong plunges. One thing to note is that Male Flower finally activates its passive thanks to Gaming causing a reaction. Otherwise, his skill's damage is treated as plunge attack, so it doesn't activate the passive when looking at this part of the description. But moving over to a vape setup, here, Shanyun, Farina, and Bennett enable Gaming to deal quite big critical hits as well. Although obviously this team is putting in a lot more effort buffing this guy up. However, it is nice to see even with a free-to-play Claymore and C0 build, Gaming can put out some serious damage. Also, you'll notice how he alternates between using skill plunge and regular plunge. Well, it can work nicely as a fast way to keep doing vape damage, without needing to wait for Swanee to come back. Obviously, this is only possible with C6 Bennett, so keep this in mind. So yeah, by himself he hits like a wet noodle, but with the right buffers and teammates, you can push for some really good damage. And on top of that, his second passive allows his plunge skill to deal 20% more damage. But if he's not above 50% HP, then he only gains 20% incoming healing bonus. Still, I've noticed how he barely regains half his energy after using the burst, and that's including the particles he caught from spamming the skill. So while Mailed Flower is great, with this current build, he only has 110% ER. And for Abyss, I am most likely going to switch to ER Sans or ER Weapon instead, because he does have to carry the team, and that means he heavily depends on his burst. But maybe his teammates can also help with that. Alright, so after some testing, right now his best team comps boil down to exactly 2 variations, Melt and Vape. And maybe later on more archetypes will be discovered, but for now, starting with Vape teams, Benny Boy along with an Animo and Hydro unit will be the core for Gaming. And then of course, make sure there's a few Favonius weapons in the team, while Gaming has at least 140% ER. But of course, this number depends on the enemies as well as the whole team. Now, unsurprisingly, my favorite Vape team so far is made up of C6 Benny, Shanyun, and Farina. This trio can now enable anyone, especially a Claymore unit, to hit really hard with plunges. And while you may think that Shanyun can be redundant with Gaming, her second passive actually boosts his skill plunge attacks. And as I've shown you earlier, you can even alternate between the regular and skill plunge to capitalize on that vaping. But honestly, it's also enough to just vape with the skill plunge if you don't have or don't want to activate C6 Benny. Moving over, there's also melt comps. Again, Bennett's buff is quite essential for big damage, while Animo unit and Rosaria will help trigger melts for Gaming. I haven't really found another good cryo unit who can apply fast enough cryo off-field, so Rosaria is the best of the bunch. And for Animo units, as long as you can trigger that Pyro Swirl, they are good enough. But obviously, Kazuha and Sugros are great choices, since they can group up the enemies, and AoE attacks coming from the skill plunge become a lot more reliable. Also, make sure to keep an eye on the enemy when they have Cryo Aura, because there is a bit of a delay how fast Rosaria can apply it. So only commit to the skill's plunge animation when they have Cryo on them, which can feel a bit slow, but once you get the hang of the rhythm, it's not that big of a deal. And yeah, that's 2 team archetypes I found fun to use that are also strong, but let's see how good Gaming can get with Constellations. Okay, so his C1 is pretty decent. When he meets back with Swanee during the burst, he will now regain 15% of his own HP, and this helps him with maintaining Hunter 4-set critical stacks, speeds up Farina's fanfare point generation, and if you're using something like Tidal Shadow Claymore, it can trigger its passive as well. Moving over, C2 is going to be useful in teams where he can get overhealed or when he overheals by himself. So like, if he has continuous healing coming from someone like Shanyun or Kokomi, he can then gain 20% attack buff for 5 seconds. I mean, it's alright. Now, C3 is where he gains a boost to his skill's plunge damage, but C4, in my honest opinion, is his most important constellation when it comes to fixing his energy issues. Restoring 2 energy from each skill's plunge attack when he hits an opponent is pretty big, and despite the fact there's a 0.2 second cooldown, it should be enough to just trigger each time from the skill. And this can end up as 10 to 12 extra energy, which will reduce his energy requirements. Now, C5 improves his burst damage. It's decent enough to look at a bigger number, but it's not as impactful as C3. Finally, C6 is his best upgrade because now his skill's plunge gains 20% critical rate and 40% critical damage. And on top of that, the skill's plunge attack's radius is improved, so that means it becomes easier to hit multiple enemies. Like, to me, this constellation is obviously a huge bait, since it gives a massive boost to Gaming's personal potential. Like, the difference between C0 and C6 is day and night, and sadly, Hoyo has been treating new 4-star characters this way for a long time now. But I would say if you want to pick up some extra constellations, C4 would be the best stopping point. Although honestly, that's too much Primo Gems, unless you get lucky or still keep pulling for that featured 5-star. Anyway, let's forget about the constellation shenanigans and quickly talk about how to build him. Now, when it comes to his weapon options, few of the best ones that come to mind would be Serpent Spine, especially if it's refined, or you can also use Red Horn as a stat stick. Other good 5-star stat sticks would be Verdict and Beacon, but R5 Serpent Spine usually ends up about as good, since if you can avoid taking damage from enemies, his skill's HP drain does not remove the stacks, and he can dish out some of the best damage with this Claymore. But it's a Battle Pass weapon, so, you know, don't buy it just because of this. Also, there's Wolf's Gravestone if you use ER Sands, which can be good. Now, if you're playing Vape teams, Rain Slasher is really good. That extra damage from passive and big elemental mastery boost from substat are quite strong. But as I've said before, if you're having trouble having his burst ready off cooldown, Favonia's Claymore is going to be really important for him. In fact, that's the weapon I will be using on my own C0 Gaming on my main account, until I can obtain either godlike ER Sands or gain a lot of ER substats when using something like Serpent Spine. Finally, there's quite a lot of decent free-to-play options. Mailed Flower comes to mind first, then there's the Ultimate Overlord Claymore, which recently was awarded from an event, and at worst case scenario, you can also craft Tidal Shadow, which does its job pretty well. Now, for his artifact sets, hands down, Hunter set is his best in slot, but if you don't have it, you can also use Vermilion 4 set, although that attack buffing does not work well with Shanyun, since she only cares about critical damage, EM, and elemental damage when boosting plunge attacks. Otherwise, you could also use Crimson Witch 4 set as well, but at the end of the day, Hunter 4 set is his most versatile and best artifact loadout. Finally, when it comes to stats, you can see the substat priority here, while Attack Sands, Pyro Goblet, and Critical Rate or Damage Circlet are pretty obvious main stats you can go for. But again, if you struggle with having the burst ready, use Energy Recharge Sands. Otherwise, you could also swap out Attack Sands with Elemental Mastery for better melt and vape damage. Overall, I think Gaming is a pretty fun unit, and he is able to put out good damage, but only if you can dedicate some strong supports for this cause. Obviously, he will be carrying the teams with his damage, so he does heavily depend on good stats and gear loadout, but the fact that C6 provides him with so much value, not to mention the energy issues that get partially solved by C4, he will just feel a lot more different compared to C0, and the damage performance will be vastly different, so keep an eye on this when watching other showcases. Anyway, hope you found this video useful. Make sure to press the like button and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.